Shalom. Happy holiday. We are beginning the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, booths. My message is called Sukkot, the first road not taken. My wife and I honeymooned in New England 42 years ago. I still remember that wonderful time. One of our favorite stops was the Robert Frost Farm in Derry, New Hampshire. In the woods behind the farmhouse, some of Robert Frost's most famous poems, laminated on boards and attached to trees, were positioned in just those places where one could imagine the poet having gained his inspiration. At an intersection of two paths traversing the wood, I'll bet you can guess where I'm going with this, was posted "The Road Not Taken." I had enjoyed the poem ever since learning it in grade school, but reading those words in that setting transformed the work into a lifelong inspiration. As you probably know by heart, here is the poignant ending of the poem. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Many centuries before Robert Frost wrote "The Road Not Taken," the Bible describes another road not taken. And as was the case in New Hampshire, that decision too made all the difference. Here's how the Bible describes it. The book of Exodus, chapter 13, verses 17 through 18. God did not lead the Israelites by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said, "The people may have a change of heart when they see war, and return to Egypt." So God led the people round about by the way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds. You might be wondering, is there a connection between the holiday of Sukkot and this rumination about roads taken or roads eschewed? The connection, in fact, is surprisingly obvious. Sukkot, as a place name, was the Israelites' first encampment after leaving Egypt. As the Bible relates one chapter earlier, Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot. Yes, while Sukkot means booths, it is also a place name. There are several places with that name in the Bible, but this one is critically important for the subsequent history of the Israelite people. It is beyond the traditional limits of Egypt, heading east into the Sinai. An Egyptian text from the era of the Pharaoh Ramesses II, the time of the Exodus, describes Sukkot as a one-day journey from Pi Ramesses, the city in the Nile Delta built with Israelite forced labor. Sukkot, the place Sukkot, was the first stop on the west to east travel route known in Hebrew as the Derech Hamidbar, the way of the wilderness. It is important to know that this was not the more trafficked of the major routes from west to east. The most trafficked one was known to the Egyptians as the Way of Horus. The Bible calls it Derech Eretz Pelishtim, the way of the land of the Philistines. And that way hugs the Mediterranean coast, whereas the Derech Hamidbar is much more forbidding geographically. When the Bible refers to the commandment to dwell in booths, using the word Sukkot now in its common noun sense. The Bible has a commandment to dwell in booths for 7 days at this time of year. It explains, "For I," God speaking, "caused the Israelites to dwell in Sukkot when I took them out of the land of Egypt." Leviticus chapter 23, verse 43. The standard reading of that verse is to take Sukkot as a common noun, meaning booths. But that is problematic, because everywhere else in the narratives about the Exodus and the wilderness generation, the Bible describes the Israelites not as living in booths, but as living in tents. We might answer that tent and booth mean the same thing, but as a matter of fact, they do not. And what's more, the Bible knows that. In the book of Jonah, chapter 4, Jonah encamps outside the city of Nineveh to see what God will do. Will he pardon that city, or will he destroy it? Jonah builds a sukkah, a booth, for shelter. Then God causes a fast-growing plant to rise up and shelter Jonah further. That narrative would make no sense if Jonah were in a tent. As the traditional rabbinic commentator David Altshuler wrote in his commentary Mitzudat David, a booth has cut foliage as its roof. As the foliage withers in the hot sunshine, its shade progressively diminishes. A tent would not become progressively less useful. So back to the verse. What else might it mean to say that God caused our ancestors to live in Sukkot when we left Egypt? What if we read the reference in Leviticus 23 as a proper noun, not as a common noun? Then we'd be saying, or then the Bible would be saying, God caused our ancestors to dwell in the place called Sukkot when taking them out of Egypt. In commemoration of that, we ought to dwell in Sukkot, this time meaning booths, each year at the harvest time. What insight can be gleaned from understanding the Bible this way? God's causing us to go not towards the Mediterranean, but rather to Sukkot and encamp there, was part of the divine strategy outlined in the passage from Exodus 13 that I quoted earlier. God's rationale was to prevent our ancestors from opting to turn back and return to Egypt. Strange as that may seem, given the rigors of slavery, the Bible itself reports that when the going got tough in the wilderness, the Israelites fantasized about returning to Egypt, even though it would have meant giving up their freedom. Sukkot, therefore, is a short way of saying the route of the wilderness, the road not taken by most people. Sukkot meant accepting the hardships of the wilderness as the price to be paid in order to keep our journey from collapsing at its very start. Sukkot represents the stubborn persistence of the Jewish way in the face of the difficulties of living in a hostile environment. We are saying that God wanted the religious insights born of our suffering to be made known to the world, not to be forgotten at the time of its birth. In Jewish tradition, the holiday of Sukkot celebrates God's solicitude for our people during the entire 40 years of the wilderness sojourn. As we can see, that began at the very first step. A journey of hundreds of miles began with a single detour. The road to teaching ethical monotheism to the world, the road to teaching the world to cherish every individual as a vessel for the image of God, the road to modeling how to love the neighbor and even the stranger as oneself. This road began with another road not taken. On this holiday of Sukkot, may we in our own generation continue the journey towards a world of peace and blessings. Amen.